Alright, so I figured I'd give this video thing a try, and apologies in advance that this will probably be low quality. Hopefully that quality gets better over time, but we'll see. So I was thinking about what I wanted to do this first video on, and open opportunities everywhere. And I was kind of get to this idea by Pam Keith, a lawyer out of Florida, who was talking about how she wants, basically as a prerequisite for gun ownership, to have some form of gun liability insurance. And she's talking about how it'd be great and end gun crime, or at least make someone carry the risk. I don't know. And someone in her replies pointed out that that's an interesting concept, but in practice that's just going to make owning a gun more expensive, and a lot of people, particularly in like high crime areas, will have trouble getting car insurance, at least at an affordable rate, because it's more expensive. There's more crime in the high crime area, therefore insurance companies are aware of that and they charge more as a result. And so this person, named Darla, mentioned that basically this will just make it harder for poor people to own a gun. To which Pam Keith said, well, I don't really care. Guns are not a necessity, which, I guess in the most literal sense of the word, sure. But she doesn't really care that, poor people can't own a gun. And it got me thinking about this topic I'd been kind of considering for a long time, but never really got around to writing on it specifically, about how, the history of gun control is really a history of discrimination, and how it's ironic that all these left of center people will advocate for gun control across the board without even realizing that what they're really advocating for is attacks on the poor and attacks on minorities. So I figured what better topic to kick this video stuff off with than to talk about how gun control is discriminatory. And nobody really talks about that. A few people in libertarian and even right circles do, but it doesn't have really mainstream knowledge, so hopefully I can shine a little light on that. So when I was looking around for some sources on this, I came across a really good one by Steve Eckwall, called The Racist Origins of U.S. Gun Control: Laws Designed to Disarm Slaves, Freedmen, and African Americans. And so basically, to give you the synopsis as briefly as possible, back in the day, the slave codes wouldn't let slaves own guns, and then once slavery went away, they just renamed the slave codes the black codes, and they made sure that, even though they're no longer slaves, they made sure that black people couldn't own guns. And Steve goes into a lot of detail here. He has laws from 1640 to 1995. I counted like over 50 of them. So I just want to run through a few of these to kind of show you kind of where the discrimination began and how it evolved over time, and then we can kind of get to modern day stuff. So the earliest law that Steve has here is Virginia 1640, a race-based total gun and self-defense ban. So the language here is, quote, prohibiting Negroes, slave and free, from carrying weapons, unquote. It's not just guns, it's clubs, knives, sticks, whatever. But the point is that this is kind of where it started. And so you go over time, Virginia again in 1712, quote, an act for preventing Negroes' insurrections, unquote. So here we see that the impetus for early gun control was to prevent an uprising from oppressed people. And I'm going to be skipping over a ton of laws and a ton of years here because there are just so many of them, and I'm not trying to make a 2-hour video, but you get the point that this is kind of where it started and where it keeps going. So then we can get to 1791, the Second Amendment is ratified, and then the very next year, blacks are excluded from the militia, which means that they kind of try to get around that whole Second Amendment thing and make it so that the Second Amendment doesn't apply to black people. And of course, natives and every minority under the sun, just whites can own guns. Um, 1806, Louisiana, complete gun and self-defense ban for slaves. So not only can they not own or possess or be lent guns, they can't even protect themselves, which of course is kind of the point of having a gun. 1819, South Carolina, slaves can own guns, but only if their master says so. Um, Now, you find me a master that would let his slave own a gun. Good luck with that. 1825, Florida, slave and free black homes are searched for guns for confiscation. And this is the first of many such acts in Florida and around the U.S. where, these people aren't hurting anyone. If anything, they're the ones being hurt. And they're just subject to all these warrantless searches, and their guns are taken away just to make sure they can stay oppressed. A few years later in Florida, free blacks can carry guns if the court approves a permit. Again, much like the master situation, early 1800s in the South. Good luck finding a court that will do that. Moving a little further up north, we get to Delaware, 1831, same thing. Court approval is required. Good luck with that. Maryland, Virginia, both in 1831, they both had entirely race-based bans where blacks could not carry arms even if they're free. Florida has another gun search in 1833 where, again, warrantless searches in the homes of slaves and freed blacks. And like I said, that's just a long history there. Going through history, then we get a little later into the 1800s. We're in the 1840s now. Then this whole idea was that, blacks are not citizens even when they're free. And this is where, you can see this constant push to keep them in this other class where, the rights apply to the in group and they're in the out group. So therefore they can't have these rights. And that's, a long history, of course. Okay, so post-Civil War, well, late and post-Civil War, blacks will require police approval in the South, police and employer approval in Louisiana. Alabama, right after the Civil War, passes a total race gun ban. Now that slavery is gone, they have to readdress the issue. And they prohibit, quote, any person to sell, give, or lend firearms or ammunition of any description whatever, end quote, to any black. And, Alabama is not alone in this. Most southern states had some sort of, either a prohibition or a strict licensing requirement. A lot of that happened after the Civil War because the South just, they lost slavery, so they wanted to make sure they could take care of the gun issue. And of course, right after the Civil War, the KKK is formed, and this ties into black gun ownership because, like I said, in the South, blacks weren't really allowed to own guns, even though they were now freed. And there was a long history of, I shouldn't laugh, it's terrible, but sheriffs in the South would have an interesting habit of doing these warrantless searches and taking away black people's guns. And oddly enough, the KKK would come into town right after that, right after the blacks were, dispossessed and disarmed. And, you don't have to be a cynic to see the connection there and think that maybe those two things are connected and that maybe there's a reason why they're taking blacks' guns away. And interestingly, this is where, now that slavery is gone and, we're starting to get equal rights amendments and stuff, like the 14th Amendment, for example, where blacks became citizens across the board. Now we can't, use this old white, black, citizen, non-citizen type thing. Now the governments have to find, a different means of depriving blacks of gun ownership. So this began in 1870 Tennessee, where they realized that they couldn't really pass legislation based on race. So what they did is they passed legislation based on economics. And what they did here is they banned the sale of cheap handguns, and they allowed the sale of Army and Navy model handguns, which a lot of whites already owned and could afford to buy. So they banned the low price or the low cost option and made it so that only the expensive option remained. And of course, that wasn't on the face, it wasn't intentionally designed to prevent blacks from owning guns, but the effect of it, of course, was to prevent blacks who, were just freed recently and didn't have a whole lot of money. They couldn't afford to buy a gun, and therefore they were left unprotected. And this is called the Saturday Night Special ban. There's like 5 or 6 of those at least in this list. I won't get into all of them, but I mean, suffice it to say that Tennessee adopted another one later on, and Arkansas, Alabama. I mean, all over the place, they started realizing that since they couldn't ban guns based on race or citizenship, they were able to ban guns based on economic reasons. And let's see, going through the list here. Yeah, so even in the North, they're doing the Saturday Night Special stuff where, if you can't keep a black person from owning a gun because they're black, you can do it because they're poor. And of course, they're poor largely because of state action, at least at this point in time. And so it really worked out pretty well that, they could get around that whole racism thing and not even have to mention it. And, it could look like they're just trying to prevent crime or something, but we all know what they're really doing. And so this takes us through the whole civil rights period in the 50s and 60s. The next notable thing here, the Gun Control Act of 68. And this was an interesting one because it was, pretty big comprehensive legislation on gun control. And even the proponents were admitting that, look, this isn't about controlling guns, it's about controlling blacks. I'm going to read a little excerpt here from Robert Sherrill. Quote, "The Gun Control Act of 68 was passed not to control guns, but to control blacks." End quote. And I mean, that's a proponent of the legislation right there, admitting that, hey, we don't care about guns. We care about black people having guns. And I mean, that was the predominant viewpoint at the time, especially among proponents of that law. And it really carries through today. And so this is the last instance of really seeing pretty obvious race-based discrimination in gun control. It becomes a lot more economic after that, which of course economics and race are, somewhat tied, particularly as I said, through state action of, the history of either depriving certain people of certain rights or certain opportunities, and then of course they're more likely to be poor as a result. And then since they're poor, they can't own guns. So, I mean, I'm preaching to the choir. Y'all know how the cycle works. So Maryland and Illinois in '88, they both started taking economic action on guns. Maryland banned more inexpensive handguns, again, to keep, essentially poor people out of the gun market. Illinois was interesting because this is where we saw the tie between gun control and government housing. So what happened here was that the Chicago Housing Authority did this thing called Operation Clean Sweep, where they went through all of the public housing. And what they did was they basically, searched for guns and narcotics and stuff warrantlessly, of course. Why would you do it the right way? And, they just took all contraband that they could find. And this really kicked off a string of this happening where, it wasn't just Illinois, it happened on a national level where, pretty soon President Clinton was wanting to do the same thing. And, it was happening in Virginia as well, where, if you lived in certain subsidized or government housing, then you couldn't own a gun. And, that's just, it keeps happening today where, of course, you have certain restrictions on housing. And again, that's probably another video up in and of itself, so I'm not going to get too deep into that. But I wanted to move a little more onto present day because I know a lot of that stuff is, from 1640 to 1995. That's 26 years ago now. So here I should make it a bit more modern than that. So I wanted to bring it up to kind of present day, really more 2019, 2020, and just talk about the Democrats that were running for president. One of them, of course, Elizabeth Warren. She was proposing basically just a tax increase. So at the time, the federal excise tax on, let's see, for handguns was 10%, and for shotguns and rifles was 11%. And so she wanted to raise that to at least 30. The ammunition tax was 11%. She wanted to raise it to 50. And her whole plan here was, oh, well, this will get guns off the streets. It'll deter gun purchases. It'll, there'll be fewer guns in circulation, whatever. But what she's really doing here is just screwing the poor, as she tends to do. Her whole shtick is about, she wants to really stick it to those millionaires and billionaires and, rep the working people and the average Joes and whatever. When really she's full of BS on that, because what she's doing here is just making it harder for the poor people, the average Joes, the people that she claims to represent. She wants to make it harder for them to own guns, while people like her, who, highly educated, government ties, all that, they're rich, they can just, pay some security force to guard their house and live in a gated neighborhood where, the poor people don't have that hate using this word, but privilege. And, she wasn't the only one. This is a pretty mainstream Democratic proposal to increase taxes on guns in some way. And, of course, Biden was no different. He wanted to, again, have a gun tax. I think his is more about like numbers of magazines and capacities of magazines, and it was based on you pay a certain tax if you got a certain magazine. But his idea was, again, like Warren, just to kind of deter that purchase. And this gets into something that, I've written on before, that what you're really doing with these gun taxes is you're not really deterring a purchase, at least in most cases. If you're willing to shell out $1,000 on a gun, what's another 200? I mean, yeah, that might make a difference, but again, if you got that much disposable income, you're probably going to be willing to throw 200 more in. But what if you're, a poor person or a poor family who can't afford to pay that extra 200? That's groceries, that's part of your rent, that's whatever. So it's really, this tax is annoying to the people that can afford it, and obviously it sucks, but you're going to pay it because you can afford to and you want your gun. But if you're a poor person, then you can't. This isn't just an annoying tax, it's a prohibitive tax, and you're essentially, in effect, stripping poor people of their right to bear firearms. And of course, as we all know, there's a strong link between poverty and crime. So if anyone needs the gun, and I'm not going to say that some people need it less than others, but you'd think that if we want anyone to own a gun, it'd be the poor person in a high crime area who needs to defend himself or herself, And apparently the people on the left that support gun control just think that these poor people can rely on the cops after, everything that happened last year. You're going to have them rely on the cops. It's just nonsensical. And after what we've seen recently, and not just recently, but throughout all of history, the poor should probably own guns. And I don't. Obviously, it's unconstitutional to pass gun control and all that, but not only that, it's nonsensical and it's discriminatory, which is weird because the left likes to play this game of the holier than thou act, where they every time they see discrimination or aggressions, microaggressions, whatever, they cry about it and go to Twitter and they love to name and shame, when really they're the ones that are promoting probably the worst discrimination when you think about it, when you're depriving these people of the ability to defend themselves and making them rely on the cops that the left will admit are, at best, not very good, and at worst, racist fascists. And so, I don't know. I hope you all learned something about how gun control is really just based on discrimination and always has been and always will be. And I mean, share this with your leftist friends, and after they call you a racist, maybe they'll learn something.